On July 14, 2014, a heavily modified C-130 Hercules transport aircraft taxied down a remote tarmac in the high desert of the American West. The massive turboprop engines howled, straining under the weight of a highly unusual payload, totaling over 40,000 pounds of pressurized, specialized equipment. Inside the dark cargo hold, technicians adjusted heavy-duty valves attached to massive steel canisters, their faces illuminated only by the faint green glow of the instrument panels. No one on the ground knew exactly what the cargo would achieve or what was about to happen when that bay door opened over a vast white wasteland. What occurred over the next decade was something absolutely nobody predicted. It was an environmental event that stunned researchers, defied traditional ecological models, and remains a subject of intense discussion among scientists to this day. My name is Marcus Vance, and this is the full arc of the Great Reclamation. By the end of this account, you will understand three specific things: how human engineering can inadvertently trigger ancient biological survival mechanisms, why a 2 billion-gallon intervention required a completely different kind of natural catalyst to succeed, and how a seemingly dead landscape can retain memory. But to understand this unprecedented resurrection, you have to start with something unexpected: the microscopic geology of Pleistocene dust. Long before any water was pumped, and long before the lake dried into a toxic basin, the foundation of this valley was shaped by ancient microscopic organisms known as diatoms. According to a seminal 1998 study published in the Journal of Paleolimnology, the sedimentary layers of these ancient lake beds contain highly specific silica structures that dictate how water interacts with the upper crust of the desert floor. These microscopic skeletons form a dense, impermeable barrier, acting as a natural seal that can hold water above the water table for centuries, provided the delicate chemistry of the soil remains undisturbed. For decades, modern agricultural drainage completely ignored this unique geology, treating the arid basin as a mere disposal site for chemical runoff and heavy metals. By the turn of the 21st century, the water had entirely vanished, leaving behind a blinding crust of alkaline salt that poisoned the local winds. The regional ecosystem was declared functionally dead, a sterile monument to human negligence. But that is not what happened. As the dust storms worsened, regional authorities realized they were facing a public health catastrophe of continental proportions. The toxic dust was traveling hundreds of miles, settling on major metropolitan areas and agricultural valleys. A desperate, multi-agency coalition formulated a radical plan. They would divert and pump exactly 2 billion gallons of treated fresh water back into the deepest depression of the dry lake bed over a period of 24 months. The goal was purely containment. They wanted to create a shallow, permanent water blanket to trap the toxic dust beneath the surface. It was a mechanical solution to a mechanical problem. They believed the water would simply sit there, a sterile pool in a dead basin, preventing the wind from lifting the poison. Yet, what they found next changed everything. When the massive diesel pumps roared to life at the diversion canals, forcing thousands of gallons of water per minute through miles of steel piping, the immediate results were disheartening. The dry earth absorbed the liquid ravenously, defying the expectations set by the ancient diatom models. The first 500 million gallons seemed to vanish completely into the parched topography, leaving nothing but damp mud that baked under the fierce desert sun. Engineers worried that the underground aquifers were draining the project dry, rendering the 2 billion gallon target utterly useless. For the first 3 years, the site remained a brown, muddy eyesore, showing absolutely no signs of ecological recovery. The water chemistry was highly volatile, saturated with decades of accumulated salts and agricultural fertilizers that had leached from the deeper soil strata. Experts widely predicted that even if a permanent pool formed, the water would be too toxic to support any form of complex life. Nobody expected what came after. The project entered its 5th year with very little fanfare. A shallow, brackish lake had finally stabilized, covering roughly 3,000 acres, but it remained entirely devoid of visible life. The water was clear but eerie, a silent mirror reflecting the barren mountains. Biologists who sampled the water reported that while the dust was successfully contained, the high salinity and elevated pH levels created an environment that was effectively a biological desert. It appeared that human engineering had created nothing more than a giant engineered evaporation pond. The consensus among the scientific community was that without active multi-million-dollar biological seeding programs, the lake would remain dead for generations. And here is where the story turns on a piece of pure luck. In the late autumn of the 6th year, an atmospheric river of unprecedented scale swept across the Pacific coast, veering hundreds of miles off its typical course and dumping record-breaking rainfall directly over the surrounding mountain ranges. This massive, unpredicted meteorological event caused a nearby river system, one that had been disconnected from the basin for over a century, to breach its banks. The floodwaters did not just bring more volume, they brought something completely unmapped. The raging torrent tore through an isolated private nature reserve nestled in the upper foothills, a sanctuary that had quietly preserved a small, relict herd of American plains bison. As the floodwaters swept through the valley, a group of 12 bison was cut off from the main herd and forced to migrate downward, following the natural contours of the newly formed waterways. They traveled miles outside their protected territory, eventually wandering directly into the restricted, fenced perimeter of the pumping project. The arrival of these massive herbivores raised an entirely new emotional angle, one deeply tied to the historical memory of the American landscape. For centuries, these animals had been systematically eliminated from the region, their absence fundamentally altering how the land processed moisture and vegetation. The engineers and politicians viewed the bison as an unwelcome complication, a potential liability that could damage the expensive monitoring equipment and jeopardize the fragile containment infrastructure. There were immediate calls to humanely remove or relocate the animals, with critics arguing that large mammals would only trample the delicate mudflats and accelerate the erosion of the newly formed shoreline. They represented an unpredictable variable in a highly controlled, synthetic environment. The bureaucratic machinery began to move, preparing to tranquilize and transport the herd away from the water project. But the biggest surprise was still to come. Before the relocation teams could assemble, field biologists noticed an extraordinary transformation occurring precisely where the bison were grazing and wallowing along the muddy perimeter. A study published in Ecology in 2023 demonstrated that large ungulates act as profound ecosystem engineers in arid environments. As the bison moved through the heavy, alkaline mud, their deep hoofprints broke through the crust of toxic salt that had formed at the water's edge. Each footprint created a miniature, micro-topographical basin that collected fresh water from the morning dew and rainfall, diluting the harsh salinity of the main lake body. Furthermore, the animals carried dormant seeds within their thick fur and digestive tracts, seeds harvested from the rich upper foothills miles away. 10 years after the first gallon of water was pumped into that dead, silent basin, the transformation reached its magnificent, roaring crescendo. The empty white wasteland was gone. In its place sat a vibrant, dynamic wetlands ecosystem that looked, sounded, and felt entirely alive. The air, once heavy with the silent, metallic taste of toxic dust, was now filled with the chaotic symphony of over 200 species of migratory birds. The water's edge was no longer a barren ribbon of white salt, but a thick, lush forest of emerald green bulrushes and cattails that rustled loudly in the desert breeze. The scale of the transformation was staggering. The initial 2 billion gallons of pumped water had been supplemented by nature to form a thriving water body that supported millions of desert pupfish and specialized brine shrimp, organisms that had somehow survived in dormant egg form within the dry crust for nearly a century. The deep, heavy thud of bison hooves vibrated through the soil, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to awaken the very earth itself. Where there was once only the blinding glare of a dead lakebed, there was now a deep, shimmering blue expanse, teeming with life, cooling the local climate and anchoring the soil for miles around. Human engineering had provided the raw volume, but it was the accidental intervention of an ancient keystone species that allowed the water to heal the land. We often operate under the illusion that we can dictate the terms of nature's recovery through precise calculations and rigid infrastructure, forgetting that healing is not a mechanical process to be managed, but a latent memory waiting for the right catalyst to be reawakened. If we provide the space and the elements, the earth remembers how to live long after we have forgotten how to listen. What are your thoughts on this extraordinary ecological resurrection? If you found value in this story of transformation, please consider subscribing to the channel. My name is Marcus Vance, and thank you for listening.